My guest today is John Garicano. John is a professor of economics at the London School of Economics and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His research focuses on the causes and consequences of innovation, and he's the author of the book Investing for Prosperity. More recently, he has worked on the measurement of management practices and their impact on productivity.
I want to start by one which is very recent research work that you've conducted on innovation and this idea of the lost Einsteins. The question that you pose is who becomes an inventor in America, and to what extent everybody kind of has the chance to become an inventor, or only certain people with certain backgrounds. And we have a beautiful example in Europe right now, which are these Turkish immigrants who, coming out of literally the second generation, the first generation, their parents came to Germany, have managed to found a company, BioNTech, which is the pioneer in the vaccination of for the COVID. And they've really done these innovative techniques of messenger RNA and have really probably are going to change the history of the world. So you studied this database. What are the main conclusions of your study, to just frame it generally first, please?
Yeah, so exactly as you said, so we're very interested in who becomes an inventor and who doesn't. So, I mean, going back to your whole original question about the future of capitalism and why we're interested in this, really what we're thinking about is, what policies can we do to stimulate growth in Europe and around the world? And one of the best ways to do that is to try and improve the supply, the quantity and quality of inventors. So the way we decided to look at that was, this is an American study, but I think this is going to be true in other countries as well, is to look at where innovators come from, where inventors come from, what their backgrounds were, how they grew up. And the way that we did this is that we, I mean, how do you define an inventor? Well, we looked at one of the indicators of that, which is whether you take a patent or not. So, if you applied or granted a patent, that's an indicator that you've done something new in the world. So that was our measure. And we took every American who was on a patent since 1996 to today, and that was our measure of millions of inventors. And then we matched that to the backgrounds. So we had information from the IRS, so we knew what incomes they had, we knew what incomes the parents had, we knew what the gender was, we had for a subsample what the ethnicity was, so we could look at this, as you said, the kind of issue of our minorities more or less likely to invent. And then we just laid out some, I think, very important facts that I think people hadn't kind of realized before. So people know that, for example, women are much less likely to be inventors than men are. That's a well-known fact. It's also true that if you look at ethnicity, African Americans are less likely to be inventors than white people are. But one of the startling things we found was, if you look at how rich your parents were, that's a very strong predictor about whether you're going to grow up to be an inventor or not. So, for example, if you were born in the top 1%, if your parents were in the top 1% of income, you were 10 times more likely to grow up to be an inventor than if your parents were in the bottom 50%. So it's an order of magnitude higher. And, that's an interesting fact. Many people say, well, that's not surprising because, there's a reason why people are rich, because they're so clever. And maybe if they're so clever, their kids are really clever. And that's, that is simply, it's because, it's a genetic thing, perhaps, that, you pass on your brilliance to your kids. But one thing we could do in our data is we actually could get holds for a subsample of the data, the kind of early scores that these kids got at school. So we knew the math tests when they were 8, their kind of English tests, and a whole bunch of things about them. And it's true that if the kids who are born to wealthier families tend to have better scores than the kids who are born to poor families, but that only explained a very small amount of the difference. Most of that difference wasn't to do with ability of the kids, the talent of the kids. It appeared to be to do with something else. And we argued in the paper that a lot of the effect came from whether or not you were exposed to the possibility of being an inventor when you were growing up. So, for example, the amount of innovation in the area where you lived when you were a kid, when you were growing up, was very strongly correlated whether you became an inventor when you were old. Even if you'd moved away and gone to a different area, even in the very narrow technology class, which was important in that particular area. So, and even when we looked at kids who, like, moved into the area when they were young compared to kids who moved into the area when they're a bit older, it really looked as if this exposure effect was important. So, to me, it kind of suggests that this exposure, I mean, from my background, I know when I was at school, I went to a pretty low quality school.
Mhm.
And the idea of us growing up to be an inventor or an entrepreneur, nobody even thought about it. Nobody even, most kids wouldn't even thought of going to university. Most of the kids dropped out when they were 16. So just this idea of being exposed, I think is very important of driving about whether you're an inventor or not. And it has a lot of policy implications. I think if you want to talk about that, we could do so. For me.
So this is fascinating, and it does chime with this idea we all think of Steve Jobs and Ballmer and all this. Not what was his what is the partner of Steve Jobs? Wozniak.
Oh yes,
Wozniak.
Was
In their garage doing this, and they were living in these communities where everybody was tinkering with computers and so on. So it does fit kind of this idea of contagion, of exposure to ideas. It seems very reasonable, but from a policy perspective, it's not very encouraging, because we cannot just spread inventors in every neighborhood to make sure everybody's exposed to the idea they can invent. How do we solve these kind of problems that are not just, okay, you have to give money to schools to be better, which is already a difficult enough thing, but you have to present kids with role models, with an environment. What is your policy?
So I think there's a whole bunch of things. I mean, we don't know the policy the solutions to this, but I think there's a lot of different things. I mean, one of the things is, I think, as you were hinting at, is that if you go to a school or a neighborhood where the schools are not good, where you're not getting this exposure, I think one of the kind of policies you can think of is to say, well, let's try and find some of the talented kids who show some aptitude at an early age for math or for science, and then do things within the school to try and support them. So for example, David Card of Berkeley has this fantastic study of what happened when they tried to track kids in school in some lower income schools, and they found that for most of these kids, it's like a gifted and talented kid, it didn't make much difference, but for the minority kids who happened to get into this, it made an enormous difference. So I think the idea of trying to identify at an early stage the kids with potential, giving them some extra help, extra resources, extra encouragements, could be a really powerful thing to do. And that's not expensive, actually. So in David's study, actually, the cost of this was pretty low. So that's one set of things around the kind of schooling. There's another set of things, and I think that there's some basic things, like there is this program in the US where they kind of basically give kids who are thinking of studying STEM or from disadvantaged backgrounds large bursaries to go and study in college. So just like $10,000 just to go. So that would be one. That was abolished actually by Congress. And that I think I've been trying to encourage as part of my I have a Biden policy proposal to kind of stimulate American growth, and that's part of the package of things I'd want. But a third thing is like the role model type of issue. So I mean, there's a lot of interesting work done by foundations like the Conrad Foundation, Lemelson Foundation, who try and expose kids by there's sending people around different schools who are people from unusual backgrounds, maybe minority backgrounds, or women in science or low-income backgrounds, and going into these schools and just talking to them. I remember that actually. That was one of the things from my school. I remember there was somebody who came from Oxford who was a working class girl who'd gone to Oxford, and she gave a talk, and that was a bit of an inspiration for us that maybe we could also think about going to a good university. So that's another thing. Having competitions. So Lemelson Foundation, for example, has these competitions that kids can enter for entrepreneurship or invention, and there's various prizes that encourages them to go in, and so I think there's a whole load of things. I think what we need to think about is how we evaluate these different programs. So which ones work and which ones don't work. So I think we don't have, because these are not programs typically people think of as innovation policies. They're not things that actually are studied enough and evaluated in the same way people evaluate welfare programs or tax policy. So I think there's a whole new founds of work which could be done by a new generation of researchers looking to see what works. And the wonderful thing about this, if you think about it, if you can have these type of policies, these supply side policies, to increase the quality and quantity of inventors, not only is that good for equity and social justice, because you're getting discriminated kids in who wouldn't be there, but it's also good for growth. So it's one of these kind of win-win type of policies.
This is
both good for equity and also good for growth.
This last point that you're making, I think, is really very interesting, right? Many people would say, well, I don't care for inequality, or I don't care for poverty. Some people would think that. And then you tell them, look, I mean, there are all these lost Einsteins who could be having ideas. And you one figure you give in your work is that if people who are not innovating, groups who have not as many innovators, minorities, women, people from low-income families, were inventing at the same rate as white men from high income, the rate of innovation in America would quadruple. So you're really kind of giving a completely new spin to fighting against inequality, which is not just, okay, it's a question of fairness, it's a question of finishing up with populism and all these things, but it's also a question of growth.
And I think that's, to me, those are the policies we need to be thinking of, because we need to be, I think one of the issues, one of the crises of capitalism that we have is that the growth model we had before COVID wasn't delivering for large parts of the population. So, a lot of the growth which we had, especially in America, was going to the kind of top 1% or the kind of wealthiest people. And we need to think of growth models which both get more growth, because we do have slow growth. That's certainly one problem. But they have also to be ones which, try and spread that growth more widely to tackle some of the roots of inequality. So really, I passionately believe those are, and even if you thought, it's a pure matter of politics, to get some bipartisan policies through. I mean, this is what Biden's going to face, no matter who wins the Georgia runoffs in a few weeks. He's going to have to reach over the aisle to at least get a few senators on his side. And I think these type of policies, which are both good for social justice and good for growth, are exactly the kind of policies that we need to be thinking of.